We've got a whole range of people. We've got Tom Sydenham, who's retro, been doing it for years and years. We've got the vintage Sandra Hill, who you may all know. We've got the antique Steve Birch. And finally, we've got somebody who began practice in the century after the end of the Qing dynasty, which is actually accurate. Oh my God, John Hicks. My brain's a little bit flat at the moment. So basically the debate for this evening is therapy or therapist. And what we're going to do is, because we're quite pressed for time, each of our presenters is going to give their opinion on this, and then hopefully there'll be enough time for us to have a bit of a plenary discussion at the end. So we'll kick off, I think, with Tom, if that's all right. This is the timing system. So I'll pass this on to you, Tom.
Yeah. Can you hear me all right without the microphone, or do you need the microphone for the... Yeah, okay, of course. Okay, well, good evening. Do you want me to stand up? I'll stand up. How about that? Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you very much for inviting me to speak to you tonight. It'll be a kind of a satellite splurge because we've only got a very short time. So the question is, which is more important in the healing process, the therapy or the therapist? I've got to get hold of this. When I was first exposed to this question, I thought, like many of you, of the chicken and the egg, but it quickly came down on one side or the other when I started thinking about it a bit more deeply. So I broke it down, and the outline of what I'm going to say is initially I'll talk about the therapist, and then about the therapy, and I'll try and draw some conclusions about my thoughts. And I do stress they're only thoughts. They're taken from observation, years of practice, and taken from teachers, some of you here tonight. So I'm very grateful to them for doing that for me, because I think it's very valuable work that we're doing. The therapist, in 1996, Constance Quayle stated that it's imperative that clinicians remember that decades of research, well, that's better, I can hear myself now, consistently demonstrates that relationship factors correlate more with the client outcome than to specialised treatments, techniques. So that's food for thought to start with. And I'm sure that many of us here, certainly at the CTA where I trained, there was huge emphasis on rapport building before we even put a needle in. It was 2 years down the line before you put a needle in. You were learning about interactions with emotions, and the courses drew heavily on rapport and trust and all the other ingredients that we see in the therapeutic relationship. Rogers, who was a psychologist in 1957, said that intellectual training and the acquisition of knowledge or the acquiring of information has, I believe, many valuable results. But becoming a therapist is not one of those results. The 5-element model, some of you will be familiar with it. If you can imagine a pictorial representation of 5 circles. With me as the practitioner, the patient's got his or her 5 circles, and if you superimpose the 5 circles in between my 5 circles and the patient's 5 circles, if you consider just the emotional aspects of fear, joy, lack of joy, anger, etc., around the 5 meridians, if I take anger into the treatment room, my own anger, I'm going to have an influence on what's happening dynamically within that model. So the more long in the tooth I get, this is an aside really, but it's to do with quantum physics. Everything is energy, and as energetic workers, as most of us view ourselves, I'm sure, everything in the universe is made up of photons and electrons. I'm convinced that the Chinese had this clock thousands of years ago. They're still trying to find the Higgs boson particle in Switzerland, but good luck to them. My view is that the Tao, the ancient Chinese talked about a place where if you were on it, we all try and shepherd our patients back onto the Tao if they've strayed off it. And indeed the ageing process does take out our form and lends itself to, the ageing process, but we can get disease processes superimposed on top of that. When scientists do tests at a quantum physical level, interestingly enough, the photons and electrons start to do what they want the photons and electrons to do. They fall into the scientific measurement categories. And so that's what I believe is one of our aspects of intention, that we heal people, even before that a needle's put in our hand. I'm going to talk a little bit about the therapy. I'm not going to focus on, we're supposed to be focusing on acupuncture here, but like many of you, I use Tuina, Qigong, nutritional support, and various other things to enhance the efficacy of my intention for my patients. You could just as well use spiritual healing or modern Western medicine or homeopathy, whatever healing vehicle you choose to employ. This is I've had to get this in. This is one of the reasons why I regard acupuncture research just on acupuncture as two-dimensional, because I don't think there are many practitioners that just use acupuncture. They use all sorts of other therapies like I've described. Whatever therapy is or does, it does give us a vision and boundaries, objectivity, and these stop us encroaching on our patient's universe unhealthily. So that's one valid reason for using a therapeutic vehicle of healing. Therapy is a reflection of our belief systems. Why did I go into acupuncture? Why did you go into acupuncture? And why are we drawn to that particular therapeutic modality? They do serve as a harness and hone our ability to help the patient achieve their healthcare potential, so they accelerate the healing process. That's one very good reason to use them. So in conclusion, what I'd say is that children have healing powers. My children, or some of them certainly have. The Maori children are asked at the age of 3 or 4 whether they want to use wood or stone, but they've got healing powers before. The babies have healing powers. If any of you have ever had children, you'll know that. Dogs and cats, it's been shown in research, they can drop the blood pressure. Horses used commonly with autistic children and other disabilities as well. They also lend themselves to the paradigm of healing, and I don't think they've ever studied at an acupuncture college, to the best of my knowledge anyway. Unless I'm missing something. John, you've had a couple of sheep or cows, have you, at the Kickham? Lynn McTaggart in The Field tells us that it doesn't matter what your chosen vehicle of healing is, as long as you passionately believe in it and practice it with honesty, integrity and intention to heal, then you'll get therapeutic changes. Palpating diagnostically at first touch, say up the vertebral column, if you are doing it as a diagnostic treatment, a diagnostic therapy, the patient can be very sore, but when you go back to that to treat it, you can find the bit that's sore and it's gone. So, and in fact, when a child falls over or we rub it, the Danes actually blow on it to dissipate the congestion of chi, or so they don't even need to touch it, and the children get up and run off. Obviously, that depends on how far down the line the cellular degradation has gone. In view of what you've heard me say, I believe that the therapist is the most important ingredient in the healing recipe. However, as a caveat, I'd add that the application of healing models enhances and accelerates our ability to heal. Thanks for listening. I'll now hand you over into the very capable hands of Sandra Hill.
Thanks so much, Tom.
Hi, I hope I'm not very good at using a microphone, so I hope you can hear me and tell me if I do this, so I'm not very good at keeping it in the right place. This is a vast subject, and it's interesting for me that actually I was imagining either I would agree with everything Tom had said, so I think, well, what's the point in me saying anything? But the interesting thing is I actually find that I've got a lot of points I want to bring up that are very in conflict with what Tom said, so that's really good. And in my I would usually approach something like this with a stance of going for what I feel more familiar with, which is maybe searching a few classical texts and bringing up some examples of a historical perspective, and I know that Stephen is going to maybe cover some of that. So, having thought about this for a while, I decided that I was going to do something that was very much more from my personal experience. And once I started to think about that, again, it's such a huge subject that I felt that I could talk about anything and almost argue any opinion I felt like arguing at that moment. But three things, I think, and I think there's pretty much got them down to three, kept sticking in my mind. And it's one of those kind of feelings, almost like a sticking point that, yeah, but what about that? What about that? So I'm almost wanting to bring to you the three real queries I was almost left with in my mind after I'd been thinking about this subject for quite some time. The first point was that when I first came across acupuncture, I was living in Japan. And I first had an acupuncture treatment that was partly diagnosed by a machine and given to me by a practitioner who didn't really talk to me. And I was behind a flimsy curtain. There were other people coming and going in the room. And you could say it was a very impersonal treatment, except that the result that it had on me was totally profound. It was a very emotional result. It was certainly a life-changing result. And this brought to me the idea that we're acupuncturists. I'm an acupuncturist. We all, as Tom said, many of us do other things. I'm basically an acupuncturist and a body worker. And for me, an acupuncture treatment is about qi. It's about the movement of qi that happens within a patient during the session, and I actually feel that it's not about a personal interaction as much as that, and I think the personal interaction for me is a secondary thing. So you could say I'm coming from a slightly different point of view here. I can also agree with Tom because I think, there's many shades of this, of course. The other thing that concerns me a little bit is most of the studies that have been done in this area have been very much done about the talking therapies, that a lot of the research that we sort of tend to quote is about psychological research, psychotherapeutic research. And again, it's a very different field. We're not actually in the business of talking to people. We can do that, and of course we all do that because we're human beings, but is that essentially what we're about? And when we're even talking about the role of a therapist in this field, are we talking about their ability to have empathy? Are we talking about their quality of their qi? Are we talking about the presence that they bring to a treatment? So I think we have to be very clear about what we're actually discussing when we're thinking about this. Coming from that, I would say that one of my concerns, and what sort of comes forward from that, probably one of my concerns when I returned from Japan and studied acupuncture in the UK, there was a lot of discussion at that time around the extent to which the training to be a therapist should be part of the acupuncture training. And this is something, again, partly because of my experiences in Japan, I was a little bit unsure about. I felt that primarily we're dealing with qi. And to what extent do we need to understand the personal dynamics in a therapeutic relationship? Because basically we're not talking therapists. I absolutely agree that sometimes this is quite essential, but one of the things that began to concern me was that certainly in certain schools of Chinese medicine, I felt there was an awful lot of emphasis being put on teaching people to become therapists, almost to the detriment of teaching acupuncture skills, and particularly diagnostic skills. I also think that if we're being taught how to be therapists, if we're being taught how to have that kind of personal encounter with people, maybe what we should really be thinking about are some of the pitfalls that we can fall into in this kind of personal encounter that we all get involved with. And for me, again, one of the things I noticed possibly that was slightly different, I would say, in my experience, say, with my experience in Japan and my experience back here, was the extent to which we're aware of patient dependency, the extent to which we're aware of the role of what could be called a charismatic healer approach, and to what extent is that okay? To what extent is that not okay? Can we condone the idea of someone sort of putting you up on a sort of pedestal as a healer? And to what extent in our own practice are we aware of when that becomes a kind of dependent relationship? Just to finish, I went to a very interesting conference in California last year, and it was a conference that was particularly about research into subtle energetics, basically. It wasn't just about acupuncture. Acupuncture was one of the themes. It was sort of about subtle energetics and the healing modalities, how healing works, when it works best. And the thing that came across in quite a few of these papers, which I found probably the most interesting, was that, and these were mostly healers who were not necessarily working with acupuncture, they were more hand healers, were saying that one of the most important things in their experience and their results as a healer was their actual ability to get out of the way of the process. And to me, you could say that this actually really relates to the Taoist idea that you bring yourself totally into the treatment room, but you also leave yourself behind. So you have to be totally present, that in the Taoist way of saying that what you need in order to follow the Tao is to put aside your preferences, to put aside your judgmental mind in a way, but to bring the clarity of your ability to diagnose, to discern, to be in the flow of the chi, to feel, to touch, to actually experience the other person as a human being without yourself and without your personality and without your prejudice coming in the way of that. So this is probably sounds a little bit contentious, but it's really just points that I want to bring to the debate. When I spoke with one of my teachers in Japan after having this first, which was quite a cathartic experience of a treatment, he actually said that, and I explained the fact that, nobody really came to see me, and I was actually quite emotionally, I had a lot of sobbing and crying, and I was actually just left on my own. And he said, it's just a matter of allowing the chi to move. We need to allow the chi to move. We don't want to attach anything to that. And if, and he actually sort of more or less suggested that the problem with us Westerners is that we tend to get a bit too caught up in why something's happening and trying to understand it while it's happening. Whereas in fact, the chi needs to be able to move in a way that we don't interfere with it. While I went to this conference in California last year, I stayed with a couple of very old friends of mine. Is it time? A couple of very old friends of mine who I knew while I was in Japan, and I had a treatment with one of them. And it was a very interesting experience for me because he kind of came into the room with a very definite presence, but it was a very impersonal presence. He felt, he did a lot of touch, he brought his, what I felt was his chi to it, but I didn't feel any element of his, what you could call, there was no sort of charismatic healer there, it was just an impersonal movement of the chi between us. So that's my, thank you.
Thank you very much, Sandra. Well, as the antiquarian here, is that what I was? Antique. I'm going to sit. Just so I don't fall over the back here. I was also worried about how am I going to address this horrible question. It's a very difficult question, right? And I had no idea what anyone else was going to say, so I thought, well, because I've been digging around in scholarly translations and investigations of the early medical literature, I thought, well, let's talk about what they said in the early classics about this stuff. Something like that. So I'm going to sit and tell you some reflections on the early literature. Oops. And there's a very interesting contrast that you find in the Neijing and the Nanjing that's continually telling us in many different contexts what is it that a superior physician can do and what is it that the inferior physician can do. It's very clear that if you're this better practitioner, you can do something different. And it's also clear from the language of it that it's following models that pre-exist the Neijing and the Nanjing, that you find the same kind of metaphoric discussion in the Confucian traditions, Mencius, the Taoist traditions, etc. So there was an early effort to describe what is it that the person who's like the sage practitioner, what is it that they can do that the non-sage practitioner doesn't typically, they're not able to do. And the main thing is that the superior person is able to align themselves with heaven. This is what they thought. And by aligning yourself with heaven, you're able to bring influences from heaven into the people around you. So therefore, the emperor enacting the will of heaven as had heaven's mandate, I think it was called. He would align himself with heaven and project that to his people so that the state would become ordered and things would grow properly, etc. So anyway, there was this model that if you can get this state inside yourself and align yourself with heaven, you can have this very positive influence on the people around you. And it seems they also thought about this in the medical literature. So, and this came up repeatedly, and you see it at least several times in the context of when you're needling, how do you engage the qi with a needle in the right way? Well, the language that they give is something that only the superior physician is able to do, implying that it's not so easy to do this. Just stick a needle in and influence the qi. So the fact the most obvious descriptions of this can be found in a passage on the sort of the core principles of doing needling that you find in Lingshu chapter 1. I cite Charles Chase and Dan Bensky. They published a translated and translation of those 18 lines with extended commentary. You can find that in the Australian journal, The Lantern. It's a very, very interesting paper. But anyway, it's really clear that there's something about the internal state of the practitioner that's needed in order, and certain skills that the practitioner can have in order to do these special things with qi and a needle. And the two things that they talked about was, in particular, this passage talks about the G, the mechanism. It's a very complicated concept, that. Being able to get the right mechanism implies the right timing. This concept relates to, like if you're holding and firing with a crossbow on somebody who's running past you on a horse, if you get the wrong timing, you don't get the guy, right? So it's very much about being able to sort of really tune in properly. And then there's an important discussion of this concept of E, which I didn't translate here. And if you get your E going and doing the right thing, and you're able to use the G, then you can make it all happen. That's what they're kind of talking about. So there's even discussions in Nanjing chapter 78 and Nanjing chapter 80 that talks about the superior physician feels the Qi with their left hand. In fact, that's the first time the term De Qi is used with reference to who feels something. And then it says, then insert the needle. So clearly De Qi is not necessarily only about inserting needles and manipulating needles. Anyway, this kind of discussion about engaging the Qi is to do with things going on inside the practitioner. And so therefore the state of the mind, the state of the body is very important to be able to do this. So here's a couple of quotes. This one I used Volker Schei's translation. Following the flow of qi requires consummate skill. When inserting needles, an error of a hair's breadth will mean failure. A kind of spirit connects the physician's heart with his hand, and that is something I can know but not explain. And then this is an important passage from the Ling Shu. This is a part of one of the lines from that. Whether meeting it or following it, by means of one's E, one harmonizes it. They translate E as attention here. And then another one, Ling Shu chapter 9, the practitioner must deeply reside in a place of stillness and divine the comings and goings of the spirit with one's sensory doors and windows shut. His mind must be focused, and then you can do it. So that's actually a description of a meditative state, the sort of internal state of the practitioner required for the proper needling techniques. So this language actually comes from probably from the Neye, which is the late 4th century text chapter of the Guanzi, and the Neye is thought to be maybe the first, if not the first, one of the first Taoist texts. And unlike the Tao Te Ching, it's not full of all this politics. It's just a description of what do you need to do to cultivate your qi so that you can become a more enlightened person. And so anyway, this passage, the Neye, talks about the E and the pivotal role of the E. Because if you do all these things right and you get your E correct, then you can welcome the qi. And then you can start to do something with it. Otherwise, you're just chasing after it and it runs away from you. That's the language of the Neye. Okay? So the E is kind of a quiet, calm attention or awareness. It's some kind of internal state. And the Neye tells us it's to do with your posture, your calming of the mind, calming your emotions, not being distracted by sensory input, a kind of non-focused awareness. And these things, when you get all this right, you can kind of gradually welcome the qi. It's a kind of more passive process. Okay? And it looks like this language from the Neye was instrumental in influencing the early literature of needling that you find in the Ling Shu. So, what is it we're supposed to do when we needle? Well, a very simple thing that I believe Elizabeth Rochard de la Vallée has used. She cites this passage from Ling Shu, chapter 75, that says, the purpose of needling is about regulating the qi. That's the basic role, that's the basic goal of needling, about bringing order of the qi inside the body to restore health. And so, in a very simple sense, we apply needles to regulate the qi. In order to do that, you have to have the right techniques. But anybody can stick a needle in the body and influence the qi, but it's not so easy to regulate it. That's a different process, right? You can stick a needle in and something happens, but regulation is a different process. And this regulation of the qi is to do with your level of development, if you will. So now I'm going to switch a little bit and talk about a quote from Zhuangzi. And this is a famous passage for those who know Zhuangzi. And I could have put some other passages up that gave similar kind of descriptions. But this passage talks about don't listen with your ears, listen with your mind. No, don't listen with your mind, but listen with your qi. And this passage is quoted by quite a number of different people as describing different stages of development and sort of the skills that come with those different stages of development. And also possibly influence different kinds of qi. So in this first stage, listening with the ears, everybody can do that. If you've got functional ears, you hear. This is kind of a metaphor for being able to perceive, being able to act. And it's kind of the work of the beginner. And in this sense, maybe if E is important at all levels, I would translate E as intention. Everybody has the intention to get your patient better. But that's not some super duper power. Oh crap, I'm going to have to speed up. So the second level, listening with the mind, is a more being able to access non-sensory information, being able to, you kind of grok, you kind of get it. Without asking, you know it. Without touching, you know it. You get a different kind of information, and different kind of interactions are happening between you and the patient through the needle and not even through the needle. And in this stage, this is the skill of a very experienced practitioner, right? After 30 years, I can do this finally, this stuff. So, and here I translate E as attention. It's no longer, it goes beyond the intention, it's more attention, being able to focus on it. And then the final part is the much more considerably developed part, which the sage has, being able to listen with the chi. And this is to do with the fact that everything is chi. Now, listening with the chi means it's a metaphor for becoming one. You understand? So here I translate E as awareness. And I've had a few teachers. I've had teachers with 50, 60 years of experience. I think they were a bit like this. They were doing things that I still can't do. Okay? So if we follow this idea from Zhuangzi, we have these different levels, and these different levels of experience engage the patient in different ways. Okay? And the very experienced clinician, the very advanced person, can do something that the rest of us probably have difficulty being able to do, or at least if it happens, we can't reproduce it very well. Whereas the rest of us are kind of struggling around. How do we use this stuff? How do we make it work for us? Right? We're still struggling with that. And this is where the theories of Chinese medicine become more important. I'm skipping a little bit in here. And so in order to engage this regulation of the qi, this is where the theories come in. We use the jingmai, we use the points on the jingmai. We take advantage of the theory of systematic correspondence. And through this model of using the theories of the jingmai and yin-yang and five phase, and using strategies described in the classics, I got to roll it up. We therefore apply diagnosis and select treatment on the basis of that, which trigger this kind of regulation independent of a process going on inside of me. So that was it.
So telling us, Steve, it's not just sticking a spike into a piece of meat then? No. Okay, I thought so. So now we're moving on to the Paleolithic era with John Hicks.
The pre-Zhuangzi
This
area.
is forward here.
This is forward.
Yep.
Okay. So first of all, the question is obviously acupuncture and acupuncturists, not necessarily therapists. And in a way, I think this is a trick question. It's not answerable in its present form, and that needs to be said. But it does question that there's something special. I think it made everybody in the room probably think, first of all, well, we're all fed up with acupuncture technology, learning the basics and so on, and it's actually something else, which is the therapist. And I really think that everybody's said that in their own way. Sandra, maybe not. So, can I put that back a little bit? So it takes it away from acupuncture technology to something more mysterious, which is what influence does the practitioner have on the process of treatment? So the question actually becomes, forget the style of acupuncture, which I don't think any of us bothered with. What is it about the person doing the acupuncture that makes the treatment more effective? So just imagine, and what would you say in your heads right now if the acupuncture part was the same? What would you write down as the difference in the practitioners? Because these people have been articulate about that, but what do you think? I'm not going to give you too long to write it down, but what do you think of all the things that have been said makes the practitioner different, who can get the best result, given acupuncture being common to us all? Somebody writing something down, that's good. So what do you think right now? You don't have to speak, but I'd like you to write it down or think about it. So I'll give you some choices. One is experience. It's familiar nowadays that everybody says if you have 10,000 hours, you'll become an expert. So that kind of is in accord with the difference between the superior and the ordinary practitioner. So that would be one answer. I think the determination to get people better is important. It can also get in the way. But I've spent a lot of time talking to practitioners, partly because I was curious about why I ended up as an acupuncturist, And very often you find that there's a very important issue in our history that gives us satisfaction if we can help people and get them better. And so I think the other thing is the practitioner's ability to get rapport. And I've been listening to Stephen and go, well, is the superior person able to get rapport? So I'll just speak for a moment about that. I think rapport is the big one. So if you didn't write that down, then I would disagree with you and say, I'll try and persuade you now that rapport is the big one. So rapport occurs when the patient recognizes that the practitioner and him or her have something in common. So I go to a practitioner, and Sandra's comments were really important to me here, and I recognize that there's something about that person where we have something in common. Now that's significant because if they're really different from me, I'm probably not going to make myself available. But Sandra put the other case in the sense that the practitioner didn't seem to be that important. This recognition of similarity is about 99% unconscious. For example, if I chat with my patient who has grandchildren, I will always respond and tell them a bit about my grandchildren. I don't think they ever go consciously, oh, he's a nice man. He's got grandchildren and he likes them just in the same way I do. But the process is unconscious. So it's one of the things I would do regularly to do that. And what I think rapport ends up with is trust. Now, trust means that this person trusts me, so they're actually more available to my treatment. So the process of healing also is unconscious. I mean, I know some people get up on the couch and say, wow, that feels better. But what happened to them was completely unconscious. So the process of healing, I believe, is a totally unconscious process, that it happens, as it were, to the person, and that's what it is. So the process of healing is unconscious, and so is the process of getting rapport and trust. So can you do anything about that? That's the issue. Everybody knows that some people you just feel close to. You have photographs of people who are actually looking at each other in the same way, so they have trust in that way, and you can see that they're in rapport. But can you build rapport? And my experience is that if you do get rapport, and I'll talk about how to build it in a moment, the consequence of having good rapport is you get higher quality information. I think we rely too much on information nowadays, but I'm not going to argue that. But you will get better quality of information if you have rapport. Emotionally, a person who trusts you, with whom you have rapport, will give you better nonverbal information. And when they get on the couch, I think this is really important. A person can get on your couch with 10% trust, 20, 30, 40, 50% trust, but the degree to which you have good rapport means that you will get them 100% on your couch. Now, if you can imagine you're going to have a treatment, how much of yourself do you actually give to a practitioner you don't know very well? Do you have a practitioner now with whom you can get them on the couch and they're 100% available to you? And I would translate that as saying 100% of their energy is available. But do you ever know with certain people you hold back a little bit? I mean, if I modeled it, it would be, I'm not quite sure. I'm 100% sure. So there's a big difference. So I think a key quality of developing this is the practitioner can actively create rapport. So that requires observation, a flexibility of behavior, and matching of body, which is quite simple, body, interests, and values. I'll give you an example of matching body. When I was kind of obsessed with this process of matching, I was walking down the street in Notting Hill in London, and I was looking for a post office. And I had no idea where it was, but I vaguely remembered it was down at one street. So as someone was coming towards me, he was appeared to be a down and out person, I actually took on his gait, physically matched him all the way. We had about 20 yards, basically, so it took my time. As I finally got into his gait and movement and so on, as we were going to pass, he came over to me and said, "If it's the post office you're looking for, it's down there and on the left." And I was gobsmacked. I looked at him as if he'd come from another planet. But I had several experiences like that when I had acute sort of body matching. So I think it makes a difference. And to be able to do it means you have to control your own body. Interests are like matching interests. If someone is really interested in their grandchildren, then of course my expression of my interest in my grandchildren makes them go, "He's a nice man," because he likes his grandchildren too. And the matching of values is deep down, most of you in this room have an important value, which is about getting other people better. So if I discussed that with you and what that was like in me and what it was like in you, you'll probably go, "He's a nice man. I will put 100% of myself on the couch." So would it be worth considering even better rapport than you already have? Why not? That's available to you. And if you want some information on that, that's my email address, and I will have written the subject, 5 key ways to get rapport. It's not easy to get rapport, and it's hard work, and it will depend on yourself. But I think it's one of the big things that's important in being able to heal people.
Actually, I'm a little bit gobsmacked, really, because I was expecting a much blander general agreement. Oh, it's really important to do the chi. And actually, what we've had here is a really is something really much more profound than that. I was really pleased at the diversity of approaches. We've not had the same story 4 times in a row, which I think is really exciting.
I thought it was the same story.
It's the same hymn sheet in some way, but actually we've had 4 completely different takes on the whole story, which I think is lovely. I think if nobody's going to stop us, does anybody mind if we just run over 5 or 10 minutes? Because officially we run out of time in the next 6 minutes or something. Is that 5 minutes fast? Oh, that's better. That's better. Because I would really like to get some feedback from people about the different approaches. But just to summarise, Tom, could you say, in a nutshell, in one sentence, if we proceed your view?
Yeah, my basic view is that the therapist has to be the most important factor in the healing process, rather than the therapy.
Sandra?
I think I might say that Chinese medicine is a extraordinary subject, and it's actually capable of working on its own. And I think sometimes we need to get out of the way of it working a bit more.
One word. So I also studied a lot in Japan, and I've had similar experiences as Sandra. People they behave really weird around me, but the effects are amazing. So they don't have, and they're not talking to me at all. They're pounding on me, but the effects are amazing. So I think it's the state of the practitioner is very important, and also the day-to-day business of running a practice and how you develop rapport, and all these things are very, very important. But there are times where you've got a really horrible person on the table, you cannot talk to them, they won't talk to you, they want you to fix them, and that's it. Go with the therapy, it still works. Sorry.
Can I have 2 words?
You can have up to 35 seconds.
Up to 35 seconds. I had an experience once when I was learning to keep rapport, where a man who couldn't see me, I was out of sight of him, and I matched him as thoroughly as I could with my body. At one point, he got up. It was intense conversation. He came over to me and put his hand on my back and said, "Life is really difficult at the moment." Again, I was gobsmacked, And I think that's got to do with state of mind and rapport as I defined it.
So has this stimulated any thought amongst the audience? Okay. It's a little bit feeble, this mic, so you might be better to shout. But try it.
I would actually challenge you all that there's something missing in your question. You all said acupuncture or the acupuncturist, but acupuncture is only one variable, and the therapist is many variables. So how can you be even comparing the two? You have to be looking at the idea of the therapy or the therapist, and there you have to be talking about the competence of the therapist to be able to do the therapy before you can be looking at whether the therapist brings something to the table. So what I'm trying to do is challenge you is by just saying all acupuncture is the same, you're taking away your own question.
There's a few people actually trying to research acupuncture right now, like Hugh McPherson and this man on my left are seriously trying to do that. It is a very difficult subject. And
well, of course, we assume that the practitioner is qualified.
Qualified doesn't mean competent.
Okay. We assume that they finished the school and that the school established competence in the student clinic. Not all schools do this. Okay. Here in the UK, pretty much every school does that, but there are many schools in other parts of the world where you go to school and there's no clinic. So that kind of competence isn't always present. But so we assume that it's present. And we don't assume that all therapies are the same, all acupuncture systems are the same. I think they probably have different strengths, but we don't know what they are yet.
And of course, there's also the problem of what medical complaint are we talking about? Are we talking about a twisted ankle, or are we talking about chronic insomnia and anxiety? So there are a lot of variables in the whole question. Any more questions?
I'm not sure the mic's working.
Hi. I was wondering if the question itself is not problematic because you're framing something that isn't reductive in a divisive, reductive way. Would, first of all, the patient be perceiving this as two separate processes, as two separate entities, the therapy and the therapist, or is it not experienced phenomenologically as one thing? In Chinese texts, is it separated, or is this our Western biomedical contrivance that we're placing on top of it? I would argue that some of these things can't be teased out and are really immeasurable. And I wonder if it's even effective to be going into this kind of question, or are we still trying to box something that is not reductive and is not from the Enlightenment into an Enlightenment box?
I'm going under the table.
I don't think what you heard up here was reductive in any way. It was a look at various possibilities, why the practitioner is more important. It wasn't about, none of us took it to be about the actual acupuncture itself, which is a difficult question in itself. In a way, you know, they all have some impact. It's a question of how and what and how much.
Any more thoughts?
I would just like to say which is more effective, the therapist or the therapy. But we haven't really defined what effective is. And I would like to go away from the Western model that effectiveness is curing ill. It's, to me, effectiveness is being with what is and helping the patient be with what is and the best that they could be. So I don't think it is about effectiveness or efficiency. I think that sort of lowers the art of Chinese medicine to how often Western medicine is practiced. And we should be being with what is. And I think one of you mentioned it about belongingness is, I think it was Stephen, is about where we're drawing our patients to.
I don't understand why you imagine effectiveness to mean anything other than why should effectiveness mean something specific in a Western model rather than meaning something on a much wider context? Are we saying it's measurable?
Well,
I don't think that was ever mentioned, and certainly I don't think anything that we were discussing was actually, because I certainly wouldn't agree with what. Yeah.
Can I just tell you all a story actually? When I was a registered nurse, I was working in an accident emergency department, and unusually it was very quiet. And I was running a high dependency unit within the A&E department, and I didn't have anybody in there. And so this old guy came in, he was about 85, and his wife was in theatres, and she was seriously ill. She had an abdominal aortic aneurysm, and they worked on her for a number of hours. And I had this guy, I was a highly qualified critical care nurse, and done lots of courses, and was very specialised. And I had an experience with this guy, and they basically cried together, and we had a really intimate healing process together. And it was stripped down. It was a human experience, and it was very effective. And the word came out of the theatre that his wife had died about 5 or 6 hours later. And he came to me afterwards and he said, that was just extraordinary what you did. Thank you so much. I didn't have a needle, I didn't have anything other than my humanism. And I think that's where we all have to start from as practitioners. Whatever add-ons we use, whether it's Qigong, Tai Chi, Moxa cupping, needling, you have to start with, as John said, that rapport. And if you don't get that, you forget it. And in Leamington, they talked about the Colorado, the path down, where the 2 mules lean into each other, and then because it's too thin for both mules to pass side by side, so they lean into each other. And that, I thought, was a brilliant reflection of rapport. That's what we need to get with our patients. And if you haven't got that, if something's going on in your life that you need to think about, that's the value of being a reflective practitioner, so that you can try and move forward from that state of not helping your patients. So that's what I'd say about that.
I think we have to be a little bit careful that we're not confusing the fact that we're all human beings, and we all, as human beings, have rapport with other human beings in many different contexts. And I totally agree with what both Tom and John are saying, in that this is absolutely part of being a human being, that we feel for other people, we are able to be with other people. But I feel that in this context and in this actual debate, we're talking about Chinese medicine, we're talking maybe specifically about acupuncture. And I just think we have to be a little bit careful that we're not wandering too far into a field that is really just about being a human being rather than our profession.
Thank you very much. Another question at the back. You may have to shout.
I really only wanted to say that what attracted me to acupuncture was my own, if you like, inner journey that was supported through my treatment. And it was sort of seeing the Chinese medicine or seeing the I would say model, but model is too Western, that allows, sorry, got slightly lost here, but in here there's a transformation, healing and transformation are talked about together a lot. And also that it allows for just a broader, well, we don't understand everything. And until we do, we can't really define these, is it therapist, is it this, and surely we're going to understand more the more we understand ourselves. And Chinese medicine is kind of about growth, healing, transformation. I'm not being very coherent. Sorry, attempted that, but there's something beyond here about the Western, about the words we're trying to use to define all of this. Sorry, what I'm trying to say.
Well, I think you're absolutely right.
Always saying much more to you.
Yeah, I think we all value. I didn't know much about acupuncture before studying it, has to be said. A practitioner I knew in my kind of youth gave me the rudiments of it, and I think that the journey that we all step onto and that growth that we were talking about happens to each of us individually as practitioners. And that's one reason I celebrate not just Chinese medicine, but Oriental medicine in all its forms, you know, again, whether it's Tai Chi or Qigong or the healing people with acupuncture. It's a life-changing event when you can climb aboard and start going with the stream.
I think I'd probably better wrap it up at this point. I want to thank Tom and Sandra and Steve and John for all the work they've put in for preparing this, and I hope it's been interesting. Thank you.
Just before everybody goes, could I say two things? I'd like to reiterate that Charlie as chair and John, Steve and Sandra and Tom rose to the challenge of what is clearly a multifaceted question. And thank you. I believe Jasmine posed the question. Is she still here? Yes. What shall we end Saturday with? Yes, let's have that one. At least 4 willing people and Charlie to chair it. So first of all, yes, again, thank you for ending our first weekend day with a great debate on this impossible question.